Stories should have a human heart, not just a cold processor. If you agree, and you want to help us keep telling stories with real soul, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. My name is Daniel Pierce, and I'm honored to be your guide. Now, let's get started. The wind on planet Karun wasn't just weather. It was a hunter. It gnawed at your bones, stealing your warmth, and snatched the words right out of your mouth. But for Nair, that savage cold was nothing. For 10 long years, she'd been living in a deeper, colder winter, a frost that grew from a single burning memory. Her wings, once the brilliant deep blue of a twilight sky, were now crammed under a heavy cloak, a secret shame. They were made for soaring on warm thermal drafts, not for surviving on this miserable ball of ice. Now, they were just a twisted mess of bruised purple, a roadmap of raised scars that served as a constant, throbbing reminder of the day an orbital strike turned her world, her sky, and her life into shattered glass and hot ash. She stood at the edge of the makeshift town, her hand resting on the knife tucked into her tunic. The blade was forged from a piece of her dead planet, its cold weight a familiar comfort in the crushing emptiness. And then, across the dusty expanse, she saw him. Kneeling in the dirt was Coulson Park, the butcher of Isha, the man who had designed her own personal hell. But he wasn't acting like a monster. He was gently trying to coax a jittery, long-bodied animal into a pen, its huge, dark eyes wide with fear. A small crayon child stood beside him, his little face wet with tears. "Shh, easy now. You're okay," Park murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, nothing like the tyrant's roar that echoed in her nightmares. "He's just not used to all this open sky, little fella. It's making him nervous." He kept the animal's leash slack, kneeling to make himself smaller, whispering to it in that same impossibly gentle tone. He held out a hand to the child. "Here, you show him. You're his friend. He trusts you." The little crayon boy wiped his eyes with a stubby three-fingered hand and after a moment took Park's hand. Together they reached for the creature. It snorted, its feathery antennae twitching, but then it nudged their joined hands with its velvety nose. Park smiled, a real smile that made the corners of his eyes crinkle, and the sight of it felt like a blade twisting deep in Nair's gut. This was the monster she had hunted across 3 star systems, this dusty, kind old man. In that moment, the fortress of hatred she had spent a decade building around her heart didn't just shake, it cracked. It was only a tiny hairline fracture, but it was enough. A tremor ran through her, and she tightened her grip on the cold handle of her knife, trying to fight off the creeping poison of doubt. Revenge was supposed to be clean. It was supposed to be simple. This was messy, and she wanted no part of it. Later, inside the settlement's dining hall, that messy feeling only grew stronger. The massive dome was lit by the soft green glow of moss hanging from the ceiling, and the air smelled of baking bread and rich earth. All around her were former soldiers, people from a dozen different species who had once tried their best to destroy one another, now sharing a meal in peace. No one was carrying a weapon. Veterans sat at long tables, passing around food in a comfortable quiet. War orphans from every corner of the galaxy, a chaotic jumble of kids darted between the tables, their laughter bouncing off the dome. Nair sat by herself at the very end of a bench, her bowl of vegetable stew completely untouched. The quiet was unnerving. She was used to the sounds of refugee camps, the whine of dying generators, the endless arguments, the sound of quiet weeping. This silence felt different. It felt like a place where all the shouting was finally over. Her eyes found Coulson Park. He was in the middle of the hall, sitting with a massive crayon who had a crude prosthetic arm and a human woman with sharp, alert eyes. He ate slowly, with purpose. Nair imagined the path her blade would take, one quick lunge over the table. Her hand rested on the hidden knife, the worn leather a familiar presence against her thigh. It would be so easy, over in 3 seconds flat. but her feet felt like they were bolted to the floor. Every time she looked at him, the image of the kind man in the dirt with the scared child was layered over the monster in her memory. The two pictures refused to merge, and the mental tug of war made her feel sick. The human woman, who had introduced herself as Soon, seemed to notice Nur was staring. She looked across the room and offered Nur a small, uncertain smile. Nur immediately dropped her gaze back to her stew, her jaw clenched. She wasn't here to make friends. She was here to be an executioner. She forced herself to take a bite. The stew tasted like ashes. The cold ache in her wings flared up, a familiar pain that for the first time in a long time felt like a welcome comfort. The hydroponic gardens were in a long, low building with a translucent roof that softened the harsh light of Karun's twin suns. The air inside was warm and humid, smelling of rich soil and things that were alive and growing. It was a place teeming with life, the complete opposite of the dead world Nur carried inside her. Her job was to check the nutrient lines. Coulson Park was at the far end of the row, his back to her. He was tending to a bed of delicate-looking flowers, moving with a deep sense of calm. It was the intense focus of a master craftsman, or maybe a monk. Then a chilling thought struck her. It was also the focus of a sniper. The patience of a man who knows exactly how to wait for the perfect moment to strike. And right then, the universe gave her the perfect opportunity. She was on a narrow metal catwalk, checking the overhead sprinklers. Directly below her, Park knelt down to inspect a plant's roots, and right beside her on the catwalk was a heavy, solid-state power cell. It was a dense brick, at least 30 kilos. It would be a horrible accident. On a remote outpost like this, accidents happened. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs. This was it. Her hands felt numb, and she couldn't seem to catch her breath. She nudged the power cell with her boot until it was balanced right on the edge. She looked down at the top of his graying head. He was completely lost in his work, a perfect, unsuspecting target. One more gentle push was all it would take. But then he looked up. He looked right past her toward the ceiling, his face impossible to read. But his eyes held an ancient stillness, and in that split second, she knew. He knew who she was. He knew why she was there. He knew exactly what she was about to do. And he didn't even flinch. He just stayed there, waiting. Then he lowered his gaze back to the dirt and closed his eyes, his shoulders visibly slumping. He was offering his life to her. He was accepting the judgment. That one simple act of surrender destroyed her. It was like looking into a mirror and seeing her quest for justice for what it really was, ugly and pathetic. The clean, righteous anger she'd held onto dissolved into something messy and wrong. She was frozen, her foot still hovering by the power cell. In a flash of movement, the huge crayon Store appeared from behind a rack of seedlings. With a deep grunt, he slammed his powerful shoulder into the metal support beam of the catwalk. The whole structure groaned and shifted a few inches. That little jolt was all it took. The power cell, already teetering, tipped over and fell. But because of the shove, its path had changed. It missed Park by a good 3 feet, smashing into a row of clay pots with a deafening crash that echoed through the entire greenhouse. Park opened his eyes. He didn't even glance at the shattered power cell. His gaze went right past Store and locked onto Nur. And his eyes held a sorrow so deep it felt like it could swallow the stars. Store straightened up and glared at Nur. "Clumsy," he growled, the word rumbling in his massive chest like an earthquake. A wave of shame, so hot it felt like it could thaw her scarred wings, washed over Nur. She scrambled down from the catwalk on shaky legs, unable to look at either of them. He hadn't fought back like the monster she had hunted for a decade. He had acted like a man desperate for forgiveness, and in doing so, he had forced her to see that her righteous anger was really just the desperate, heartbroken grief of a broken child. The knife beneath her tunic suddenly felt impossibly heavy, its weight no longer that of a weapon, but of a gravestone. She found Store in his workshop, a vast, cavernous space that smelled of ozone and hot metal. A shower of sparks flew from a grinder as he shaped a piece of steel into a crude replacement for his main left arm. His people, the Crayon, were a race of builders and warriors. Their massive arms could handle the heaviest jobs, but tiny hidden manipulators in their wrists could perform the most delicate work. To lose a primary arm was like losing half of yourself. Storr switched off the grinder, and the sudden silence was deafening. He turned, his heavy eyelids blinking sideways as he focused on her. His face was a rugged landscape of old scars and coarse fur. "What is it you want?" he grunted, his voice a low rumble. "I have to ask you about the war," she replied, her own voice feeling thin in the cavernous space. "About Firebreak Company." The old mechanic let out a sound somewhere between a scoff and a weary sigh. He snatched up a rag and started methodically wiping grime from the joints of his prosthetic arm. "That's ancient history," he muttered. "Best to let sleeping dogs lie." "The law against humans," Neri pushed, reciting the official line she'd been taught. "They claim it was for the safety of the galaxy. Was it really?" For the first time, a raw, ugly emotion twisted Storr's features. His lips peeled back from his tusks in a snarl. He let out a short, harsh laugh that held no trace of humor. "Our safety?" He spat onto the oil-stained concrete. "More like the assemblies." They were scared stiff of what they'd just unleashed, of the monster they'd created. His voice trailed off, his gaze fixed on the polished chrome of his mechanical limb. Neri stood in silence. The only sounds were the steady drip, drip of a leaky pipe and the mournful howl of the Corunian wind battering the workshop. "My unit was dug in on a moon called Tarvos," he finally continued, his voice a low growl. "We were untouchable. A fortress built into a mountain with kill zones layered on top of kill zones. We had air support from orbit. We were the elite, the line that never broke." He locked eyes with her. "Then we heard the humans were on their way. Firebreak Company. We actually laughed. A single company against a whole legion? We pictured a squad of muscle-bound heroes trying a frontal assault so we could turn them into vapor." He paused, placing his rag on the workbench and smoothing it out with obsessive care. "They hit us from a direction we hadn't even thought to defend. For 3 solid days, our scanners picked up nothing but raging dust storms in an empty quadrant. We assumed their ship went down and started to relax a little. Then, little things started to go wrong." His organic hand balled into a fist, his knuckles turning bone-white. "First, the water purifiers went down, choked with some weird kind of slime. Next, a fuel depot on the far side of the mountain just vanished. 1 second it was there, the next, a silent bloom of fire opened up in the dusk, expanding with a soft whoosh instead of a massive boom. The comms tower was next, flooding our channels with a high-pitched squeal that felt like it was drilling into your skull. One by one, they took away our supplies, sabotaged our vehicles, and took out our eyes. It wasn't a fight. It was an extermination, like being wiped out by some invisible disease. Neri knew this clashed with the official records, tales of a valiant charge and a heroic final defense. "They never hit us where we were strong," the old soldier said, his voice dropping to a hush. "They were ghosts in the swirling dust. We'd dispatch patrols, and they'd find footprints that just stopped cold in the middle of solid rock. A few minutes later, the patrol's radio would go dead. We'd find the soldiers hours later, stripped of all their gear, their power cells missing, their rifles melted into useless slag by some kind of chemical. But the soldiers themselves? They were just tied up, not a scratch on them, just staring off into nothing." He met Neri's eyes again, the 20-year-old horror still vivid in his own. It was a coward's way to fight, no honor in it at all. They wouldn't even face us. They just slowly bled us out, death by 1,000 cuts. They dismantled everything that made us an army until we were nothing but a bunch of cold, thirsty soldiers trapped in a stone cage, waiting for an enemy that refused to give us the dignity of a straight-up battle. By the time they finally blew the main gate, we had nothing left to give. They'd already won without firing a single shot that mattered. He tapped his temple with a calloused finger. They waged war up here, inside your head. They make you feel isolated, cut off, helpless. They turned our greatest asset, that impenetrable fortress, into our own tomb. That's the real reason for that law. Their method of warfare is just unnatural. They only have one objective, to end the conflict. They don't give a damn about glory or honor or conquering territory, and they will do absolutely anything to see that job through. The Assembly would rather have endless wars that keep their pockets lined than a war that actually has an ending. He fired up a power grinder, and Neri understood the conversation was finished. As she stepped out of the workshop, his words echoed in her mind. Her perception of Firebreak Company as a band of ruthless killers was crumbling, being replaced by something far more unsettling, the image of a surgeon's scalpel used with cold, terrifying, and perhaps even reluctant precision. That night, sleep offered no comfort, only fire. In her dreams, she was a small child again. Her wings were spread wide, catching the warm updrafts from the city vents on her homeworld, Isha. The sky was a flawless, dazzling blue. Far below, the sound of children's laughter floated up from the plaza as she soared with her friends. She could hear her father's voice, warm and gentle, calling her name. And then the sky started to bleed. It began as a single tiny pinprick of red on the horizon, spreading outward like a drop of blood in water. It was a chemical agent, one engineered to ignite the planet's upper atmosphere, transforming the entire sky into a giant lens to concentrate the sun's deadly heat onto the surface below. It was a kill switch for an entire civilization. The air grew heavy and hot, shimmering with a light that was no longer nurturing, but lethal. Down in the plaza, pandemonium erupted, laughter twisted into screams. The perfect blue sky of her childhood was being incinerated into a permanent, nightmarish crimson. A calm, steady voice suddenly sliced through the chaos, overriding every broadcast channel. A human voice. It belonged to Coulson Park, though she wouldn't know his name for many years. To the Governing Council and the citizens of Isha, the voice announced with unnerving composure. By the authority of the Galactic Assembly Joint Command, your world is now designated a primary military target. Your leaders were offered the opportunity to surrender unconditionally. They declined. Our primary objective is the preservation of all non-combatant life. We are now broadcasting a list of coordinates for safe evacuation corridors on a continuous loop. You have 3 standard hours to reach these corridors. We strongly advise you to comply. This is our first and only warning. The reply from Isha's leadership was thick with indignant pride. They branded the humans cowards for attacking from space. They declared the offer was a trap. They commanded their people to fight to the last breath, to die with honor for their home. And with those noble-sounding words, they signed the death warrant for millions of their own. Her father had tried to get her to an evacuation point. He wrapped his own wings around her, a desperate shield against the blistering heat now pouring down from the blood-red sky. She remembered the crushing weight of the panicked mob, the nauseating stench of burning flesh, and the deep, earth-shaking thud as the first orbital weapons struck military installations just outside the city. She woke up with a strangled cry, her legs tangled in her thin blanket. Her own wings throbbed with the phantom pain of the fire. The room was dark and silent, but in her mind the sky was still burning. The voice of the man who had offered salvation just before unleashing hell still echoed in her ears. It was such a jarring difference from the self-important speeches of her own leaders, who had chosen a pointless death for every single one of them. A sharp stab of pain snapped her back to the present. She'd been wandering aimlessly, trying to walk off the nightmare, and had tripped on a jagged piece of metal sticking out of the ground by the fence. She shot a hand out to break her fall, and a sharp edge sliced clean across her palm. The pain was real, a welcome jolt that yanked her out of the past. Dark, purplish-red blood instantly welled up in the cut. She just stared at it, feeling strangely disconnected from her own injury. "Hey, let me see that." Neri flinched, whipping around. It was Sona holding a small first aid kit. She must have seen her fall from the infirmary window. "It's fine." Neri tried to yank her hand away, hiding it behind her back. Sona just gave her a kind, patient smile. Nothing is ever just fine. Come on. Not waiting for a reply, she took Neri's arm and gently guided her inside. The crisp scent of antiseptic and dried herbs hung in the air of the small clinic. Sona had her take a seat and carefully took her hand, her touch surprisingly firm and sure. "Hold still," she murmured, her voice low and soothing. She cleaned the wound with a practiced efficiency. As she applied an antiseptic that stung with a sharp, clean burn, Neri found herself studying the woman's hands. They were strong, capable hands, the hands of a healer. After cleaning the wound, Sona applied a thin, transparent patch over the cut. "It's a bioconductive seal," she explained, her eyes not quite meeting Neri's. "Standard issue for firebreak. It'll bond with your cells, you won't even have a scar. It also has a low-level medical access key encoded into it. Don't worry, it dissolves after a few hours." "You're very good at this," Neri managed to say, the words tumbling out unexpectedly. Sona looked up from her work, and for just a moment, her gaze went distant, lost in a memory. She began wrapping a fresh bandage around Neri's hand. "You learn to have a steady hand when the whole room is shaking, the emergency lights are flashing, and the person on your table has maybe 3 minutes to live." Sona finished the bandage with a quick, flawless knot. My fingers grazed the fresh bandage on my arm. I was the chief medical officer for his unit, you know. My breath caught in my throat. I'd guessed, but hearing her say it was like getting hit. "You were there on my world?" "I was there for all of it," Sona said, her voice low and steady as she put her equipment away. "I saw Commander Coulson at his very best, and I saw him at his absolute worst. I saw him give a command that saved 1,000 of our soldiers, and I was there when he gave the one that made your home fall from the sky. This was my moment, the moment to unleash a decade of fury, to demand answers, but the fire inside me had burned out, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache and a desperate need to know why. Your methods, they were different," I finally managed to whisper. Sona stopped what she was doing and leaned against the counter. "We had to be. We were always underestimated, always outmatched and outgunned. Our unit was the scalpel they used for the dirty work nobody else wanted. Coulson's gift, and his curse, was that he didn't see war as a glorious battle. He saw it as a machine, and he was a master at finding the gears to break." She paused. "He never aimed for the soldiers. He aimed for their supply lines, their morale. He truly believed that if you could break an army's will to fight, you wouldn't have to slaughter its people." I thought of all the stories I'd heard, the chilling, surgical precision of his attacks. "And the civilians?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Were we just another part of the machine that needed breaking?" Sona moved across the kitchen and sat on the stool beside me, her knee almost touching mine. "For 10 years, I had one mission: find the man who torched my world and bury him. But the second I finally had him cornered, his doctor got in my way, and her eyes told a story I was not ready to hear." "You think you know what really happened?" she asked. I thought I did. "But if you believe this is just another story about revenge, you're about to be shocked. So stick around for the next 60 seconds, because what she told me next shattered my entire world." Her name was Sona, and her story started at a place called Velis Garrison, a key communication center on the planet Terrace. "It was our primary target," she explained, looking into a past I couldn't imagine. "High Command gave Coulson a direct order: take down that tower no matter the cost. A strike from orbit would have been quick and clean, one bright flash and it's all over." But as she took a shaky breath, she said their scanners found something High Command had missed. Hundreds of civilians taking shelter in the tower's lowest levels. They weren't combatants. They were the enemy's families, engineers, technicians, and their kids, all using the heavily armored tower as a makeshift shelter from the war. A cold sickness washed over me, a terrifying echo of my own past. "Coulson had his orders," Sona went on, her voice tight. "Take out that comms tower. Every second we hesitated, their fleets were using it to coordinate attacks that were getting our own people killed." Launching the strike was the logical move. It would have been dismissed as collateral damage. Maybe a brief, empty apology would follow as the war machine rumbled on. Sona looked down at her hands, but he refused. He broke every rule they had. He opened a direct, unsecure channel to the enemy base commander, warning him that a strike was coming and that civilians were trapped in the blast zone. He offered a 1-hour ceasefire to evacuate them. The commander on the other end just laughed, hurled insults, and called him a coward trying to trick him. So Coulson made a different call. He defied a direct order from the top. He canceled the orbital strike and sent his own soldiers in on foot. He told them, "We're taking the tower, but the lower levels are off limits. You don't even aim a weapon in that direction." He turned a simple, push-button operation into a brutal 3-day ground war. And for the next 72 hours, I watched as the cost of that choice was carried into my medbay, one bleeding soldier at a time. He completely changed the entire attack plan, redesigning it on the fly to forge a safe exit route for those families out the back while his Marines stormed the front. He knowingly sacrificed his own soldiers to save the children of the very men trying to kill them. "We lost 19 Marines taking that tower," Sona said, her eyes finally meeting mine. They were shining with tears she refused to let fall. 19 soldiers who would be home right now if he'd just followed orders. That's the monster you've been hunting all this time. A man who is haunted by the ghosts of 19 soldiers he let die to save his enemy's children. Sona then got up and crossed the room to a locked cabinet. When the war ended, they disbanded our unit, smeared our names. As the chief medic, it was my duty to handle the records of our fallen, their final words, their personal belongings. The top brass wanted to bury the entire incident, sealing our unit's files from all public record. But Coulson insisted they use military-grade biometric locks, keyed only to the surviving members of our team. He said their stories belonged to us, not to the suits in charge. So I gave him every last record. The truth of her story hit me like a physical blow, shattering my black and white world into a million shades of gray. The monster I dedicated my life to hunting had sacrificed his own men to save his enemies. What did that make the soldiers who followed him? And what in God's name did that make me? Outside, the 2 moons of Karun cast long, eerie shadows across the grounds. The night air felt thin and cold. I found Coulson sitting on a short stone wall on the edge of the camp, just staring out at the huge, dark plains. He didn't look up as I approached, my footsteps muffled by the thick dust. I stopped a few feet away. The hilt of my sword felt foreign in my hand, heavy and useless. The righteous anger that had powered me for a decade was gone, replaced by a confusing, cold emptiness. "On my homeworld," he said, his voice so quiet the wind almost stole it, "we wear pins of black glass to honor our dead, one for every family member lost." He was quiet for a moment. "You were wearing 6. He said it so simply. He knew who I was the entire time. He turned his head just enough for the pale moonlight to catch the exhausted lines around his eyes. "I remember the sky that day," he said, his voice thick with a grief that felt ancient and raw. "The exact color of it. I see it every time I close my eyes. I can still hear the broadcasts, every single one." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn key. He offered it to me, his hand as steady as a rock. "Sona told me she spoke to you, but you deserve to see the whole truth without anyone else's filter." He gently pressed the key into my hand. Its metal was still warm. "It opens the footlocker in my room. Everything's in there, the whole story. You have a right to know why. Whatever you decide to do after you see it, I'll accept it." With that, he turned back to the darkness, leaving me alone under the twin moons, clutching a key that might unlock my entire past. Coulson's room was sparse, like a monk's chamber, just a cot, a small table, and a chair. Against the far wall was a standard military footlocker, its surface covered in the dents and scrapes of a long war. My hand shook as I put the key in the lock. It turned with a heavy, final-sounding click. I held my breath and lifted the lid. There were no medals inside, no souvenirs of victory. It was filled to the very top with military data tags, hundreds of them, each engraved with a name and a service number. Each one of these little metal plates represented a human life, a full service record, a digital file of their personal items, a ghost in a box. This was the secret, unofficial archive of his disgraced unit. This footlocker was their only monument, a memorial kept by him and Sona. I had come here to find the story of one monster, but I had found a library of hundreds of tragedies instead. I reached in and picked one at random. The name Corporal R. Mbeki was etched on it. It felt impossibly heavy. I took the tag back to my room. The camp was completely silent, except for the lonely sound of the wind. I sat on my bed and tried to read the tag with my datapad. Access denied. I tried running a decryption program on it. Encryption level exceeds clearance. Biometric seal engaged. Annoyed, I looked closer at the tag and noticed a tiny glass square right next to the port, a fingerprint reader. Sona's words came back to me, keyed exclusively to the members of our unit. It was a dead end. But as I was about to put it down, my eyes fell on the clean white bandage Sona had wrapped around my hand. I kept thinking about how gentle Sona's fingers had been when she dressed my wound. It was a crazy idea. But what if a tiny bit of her DNA left on that bandage could trick the scanner? She was one of them, after all. And the way she had pressed down on the seal, it felt intentional, like she was passing me a secret without speaking a word. My heart started hammering against my ribs. Taking a deep breath, I carefully lifted the silver patch she'd put over my cut and pressed my bandaged hand onto the scanner. For a moment, nothing. Then, a small green light on the tag blinked. Once, twice, and then it switched on, glowing steady and bright. A soft chime broke the silence. It was in. The medical tag Sona, the medic, had tucked into my bandage felt like a betrayal of her kindness, but it had worked. I was using her quiet act of compassion to hack their most secret files, and a part of me felt sick about it. But I had to know. I reconnected my scanner, and this time the system opened wide. There were no letters, no personal photos, just cold, hard data. Holographic maps of my home system flared to life, painting the air with troop movements, supply lines, and invasion plans, all drawn in pulsing, aggressive colors. My entire home, my world of Isha, was just a strategic target on a screen. A glowing red circle was wrapped around my planet, with dozens of lines branching out from it like a predator's web. I pulled up the mission summary. Target, Isha Prime. Role, Sector Command and Control. The file spelled it all out. That single facility was the nerve center for their entire fleet in the sector, coordinating every ship, every supply run, every single battle plan. It was also home to their main tactical AI. The final analysis was brutally simple. Taking out Isha Prime was like cutting the head off a snake. Their fleets would be blind, their supply lines would crumble, and their forces would starve and fall apart. The expected result? A total enemy collapse, ending the war in that sector in under 72 hours. And then, I found the reason why. It was a cold, cruel calculation. The report projected that their attack would save between 40 and 50 million lives on dozens of other worlds, both human and alien. A chill that had nothing to do with the recycled air in the room sank into my bones. 50 million. My home, my memories, everyone I had ever loved was traded away to save 50 million strangers. It wasn't hate that had wiped out my planet. It was math. They put my world on one side of a scale and 50 million lives on the other, and they made their choice. My grief, my rage, the obsession that had driven me for a decade, it was nothing more than a variable in their heartless equation. The sterile logic of it was more monstrous than any simple act of cruelty. I kept digging and found the mission briefing. And there he was. Coulson, 10 years younger, his face sharper, but his eyes were already the same kind of empty I was seeing now. For 10 years, my only mission was to hunt the man who destroyed my world. To the rest of the galaxy, he was a hero. To me, he was a monster. And tonight, after a decade spent chasing ghosts, I finally had him cornered. But instead of reaching for a weapon, he just offered me a battered old lockbox. "You can kill me," he said, his voice worn down by time, "or you can open this first and learn the truth." So what would you have done? Would you take the revenge you'd spent a lifetime dreaming of, or would you risk everything to finally understand why? I chose to look, and what I saw broke my world all over again. The first file I opened was a memory, pulled straight from a dead soldier's helmet cam. It began with a dizzying plunge through a sky the color of dried blood, lit up by deadly fireworks of anti-aircraft fire. The soldier hit the ground with a sickening crunch, crashing into a field of strange crystalline plants. From there, his world, and my window into it, became a whirlwind of plasma fire and desperate shouted commands. The soldiers of Firebreak Company weren't the demons I'd imagined. They were just kids, their faces pale and grimly determined as they moved from one objective to the next. There were no war cries, no howls of bloodlust. They were just efficient, and you could practically feel their terror. I watched through this soldier's eyes as they took my world's defenses apart piece by piece, knocking out one vital generator after another. The soldier whose memory I was sharing, a Corporal Mbeki, was hauling a heavy demolition charge. He ran through a storm of incoming fire, and I could hear his breath catching in his throat, each gasp a ragged, painful sound over the audio feed. He finally slid into position at the base of a massive power conduit, his hands moving with the easy, familiar grace of someone who had done this 1,000 times. He armed the charge, slapped it against the generator's hull, and turned to run. He never made it. A single plasma bolt hit him square in the chest, and the world flipped sideways. The next thing I knew, he was on his back, staring up at that awful blood-red sky. In a flash, a medic named Sona was kneeling over him. Her face was a frantic blur of focus and panic as she worked to stop the bleeding. In the reflection on her helmet's visor, I could see the corporal's own face, twisted in agony. "It's no good, Doc," Mbeki coughed, his words thick and wet. "No good." "Don't you say that," Sona shot back, her voice shaking but fierce. "You're getting home, Corporal. You hear me?" A weak, bloody smile touched his lips. "We all are," he whispered. And then the charge he'd just set went off. A flash of pure white light consumed the screen, and the recording ended. I snatched my hand away from the console, my heart pounding against my ribs. I just watched one of my world's destroyers die, and the only thing I felt was sorrow. Every memory in that lockbox told a similar tale of duty, sacrifice, and unbearable loss. But the final file was different. It was an official recording, dated 2 days after the invasion. A woman in a spotless uniform, a delegate from the Galactic Assembly, was screaming at Coulson, the man I was here to kill. His own armor was scorched and dented, his face caked with grime. All around them were the bodies of his soldiers, lying side by side with the bodies of my people. "This was a massacre," she shrieked. "You violated every rule of engagement. This is a war crime. The Assembly will have your head for this." Coulson just stood there, letting her rage wash over him, his face completely blank. He looked like a man who had already died and was just waiting for his body to notice. "We did what you didn't have the courage to do," he finally said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "We ended a war. Millions of people on a dozen worlds are alive this morning because of what my soldiers did here." He took a single step toward her, and for the first time, the politician looked truly afraid, as if she was only just now grasping the real price of the victory she had ordered. "You gave the order," Coulson continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper as a cold fire lit his eyes. "You told us to win, so we won, the only way it was possible." He glanced from her face to the bodies of his men. "But if you ever ask us to pay this kind of price again, You'll be giving speeches to a graveyard, and you'll find only silence where there was once hate." The woman was completely speechless, the anger on her face melting into dawning horror. And right then, I finally got it. The rules of war weren't written to stop people from being cruel. They were written because people were scared of what others could accomplish when they were brutally efficient. By the time I left his room, the first pale light of dawn was painting the sky. He was sitting on a low wall in the courtyard, right where I'd left him, meditating in the cool morning air. I walked up behind him, my footsteps silent in the dust. My hand automatically went to the hilt of my sword. The cold metal, forged from the ruins of my own home, suddenly felt like it belonged to another lifetime. This was it, the moment I had imagined 1,000,000 times over 10 long, hateful years. This was the end of my story. Coulson opened his eyes but didn't turn around. He just sat there, waiting for the blade to fall. He had shown me the truth, and now he was ready to accept the judgment. I lifted the sword high over my head. I could see his reflection in the polished steel, not a monster, just a tired old man waiting for peace. And I could see my own face staring back, a woman whose features were twisted into a mask of grief. The memories from the lockbox flooded my mind. The young soldier dying for a cause he believed in. The commander hollowed out by the terrible price of his own victory. I could kill him. It would be so easy. One clean stroke and my quest for revenge would be complete. But my family would still be gone. My world would still be a cloud of irradiated dust. Killing him wouldn't bring anything back. All it would do is destroy the only other person in the galaxy who seemed to be mourning my home with me. It would destroy this strange, quiet sanctuary he had built with the bricks of his own guilt. The sword suddenly felt impossibly heavy in my hands, weighed down not by steel, but by a choice I never, ever thought I'd have to make. A single fractured question escaped my lips, so quiet it was almost lost in the morning breeze. "Why?" I whispered. "Why did you save all their memories?" He finally turned to face me, his body moving with the slow, aching pain of old wounds and older sorrows. His eyes, filled with a sadness I could finally understand, looked up at the weapon I held over him. "Someone had to," he said, his voice thick with tears he'd held back for a decade. Someone had to remember they were more than just numbers on a casualty list, that they were boys who rode home to their mothers, that they were fathers and daughters, that they all had names. His eyes looked right past me, gazing at the small town that was just beginning to stir around us. "Someone had to remember," he said again, "so we could build something better than just a monument." I looked down at the dagger in my hand. For a decade, it had been my promise of revenge. But then I looked up and saw kids chasing a ball across the courtyard. I saw Sona, the medic, humming as she worked in her little garden. This place was a future. With a choked sob that felt like it was tearing me in two, I flipped the dagger in my hand and drove it, point first, deep into the ground at my feet. It stuck there like a lonely gravestone for a past I was finally letting go of. And for the first time in 10 years, my hands felt light. The sharp biting winds of Karun were a ghost of a memory now, and the bone-deep chill that used to make Neri's wings ache had finally faded. She had found a quiet peace in her new life, tending to the plants in the gardens. The silence of the community, which once felt so isolating, now felt like a warm blanket. But one afternoon, a sputtering, beat-up dust skimmer died with a final cough right at their front gate. A new family stumbled out, refugees with skin stretched tight over their bones and huge, terrified eyes. They were Isha, just like her. Their wings, tattered and caked in gray dust, told a story of terrible loss. The whole town started to move, ready to help, but Neri was the first one on her feet. She walked toward the broken little family, her own scarred wings a silent message they would understand instantly. She knelt in the dirt, making herself small, just as Coulson had for her on that first terrible day. "Welcome," she whispered. "You're safe here now." She gently took the smallest child's hand, leading them all toward the warmth and the promise of a new beginning that waited inside. As Neri was getting them settled with clean blankets and a hot bowl of stew, She felt a pair of eyes on her from across the courtyard. Coulson was standing by the workshop, just watching. Their eyes met, and for the first time since she was a little girl, soaring through a cloudless sky, a real smile touched Neri's lips. It was soft, light, and free from all its old burdens. In return, Coulson gave her a slow, respectful nod that said more than any words could. Neri turned back to the family, and a powerful sense of peace washed over her. The weight of her past was still there, but it felt different now. It wasn't a crushing burden anymore. It was an anchor, holding her steady in a world that had finally found its calm. And high above the small settlement of Tiller's Fold, the sky stretched on forever, a huge, perfect canvas of endless blue.